In the middle of the 20th century, the US and the Soviet Union weren't just two world superpowers. They were the frontrunners in a battle that would extend beyond Earth, one for domination in space. You've probably heard of the space race before, but what was it really about? Was it just about putting a man on the moon? Or was it something bigger? A contest to see which country could gain the upper hand in technology, military power, and ultimately, global influence. Let's go back to the very beginning. The space race officially kicked off in 1957 when the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik 1, the first ever artificial satellite. Sputnik is often seen as the starting point of the more public space race. Can you imagine? A small beeping sphere, just 23 inches wide, circling the Earth every 96 minutes. Suddenly, space wasn't just for science fiction. It was real, and the Soviets were ahead. It wasn't long before the United States realized this wasn't just about science, it was about power. Sputnik proved the Soviets could launch missiles that might reach anywhere in the world. The stakes were high, and the US wasn't about to be left behind. President Eisenhower quickly approved the formation of NASA in 1958, an agency dedicated to space exploration, and also to address America's broader space strategy and Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. But the early years, let's just say they weren't easy. While the Soviets launched Luna 2, the first probe to reach the moon in 1959, America struggled to even get its rockets off the ground. So, what did the US do next? They doubled down. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, America would aim higher, putting a human in space. But once again, the Soviets beat them to the punch. In April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit the Earth. One man, 108 minutes, a complete revolution around the planet. The world was in awe, and the US was behind, again. Now, you're probably thinking, why didn't America just quit? After all, they'd already lost 2 major rounds. But quitting wasn't an option. President John F. Kennedy made a bold declaration just a few months later. America would land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Kennedy's decision was influenced by Cold War tensions and public pressure after the US lagged behind in earlier space milestones, particularly following Yuri Gagarin's successful orbit. It seemed crazy at the time, didn't it? The US hadn't even sent a human into orbit yet, and here they were, planning to send astronauts 240,000 miles to the moon and back. Project Mercury came first. The goal? To put an American astronaut into orbit and bring them home safely. In February 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth. And just like that, the US was back in the game. But it was still far from over. The moon was the ultimate goal, and both sides knew it. What makes the space race even more fascinating is how it was driven by fear as much as ambition. Each success, whether it was launching satellites or astronauts, was a demonstration of power. And in the Cold War era, power meant everything. But getting to the moon, that was a whole different challenge. You needed new rockets, new technology, and new techniques. Enter Project Gemini, where NASA developed the skills they'd need for a lunar landing, rendezvousing in space, spacewalks, and long-duration flights. They were laying the groundwork for the Apollo program, the mission that would finally send humans to the moon. Meanwhile, the Soviets weren't sitting idle. They were pushing forward with their own lunar program. They had impressive successes, like sending the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, into space in 1963. But behind the scenes, they were struggling. Their moon rockets were plagued with failures, and the leadership turmoil following Khrushchev's fall didn't help. On July 20th, 1969, the race came to an end. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin touched down on the lunar surface with Apollo 11. You've heard the famous words before. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. With that, America claimed victory in the space race. But was it really just about winning? Landing on the moon was a massive achievement, no doubt about it. But the space race wasn't just about the destination, it was about what it represented. It showed that America could out-innovate, outperform, and outlast its biggest rival in one of the most critical arenas of the Cold War. It's important to realize that both nations spent billions of dollars and employed hundreds of thousands of scientists, engineers, and astronauts, all in pursuit of that final frontier. By the end, both countries had redefined what humans were capable of. Think about it. Just a decade earlier, space exploration was a dream. Now, it was reality. But what happened after the space race ended? You might think that once America had won, the whole thing would just fizzle out. And in a way, it did. Funding for NASA was slashed in the years after Apollo 11. And while there were later moon missions, they didn't have the same level of excitement or urgency. For the Soviets, their moon program quietly faded into the background, but they turned their attention to something else: space stations. In 1971, they launched Salyut 1, the first ever space station. While the US had won the race to the moon, the Soviets were about to dominate long-term human spaceflight. If you think about it, the space race left a legacy that we're still living with today. The technology developed during this time laid the groundwork for modern satellites, GPS systems, and even our smartphones. And of course, the idea of space exploration didn't end with the Apollo missions. Fast forward a few decades, and we're looking at Mars as the next frontier. So, what can we take away from this? The space race wasn't just about science or space exploration. It was about power, politics, and proving who could dominate not just the world, but space itself. The US and the Soviet Union may have been the main players, but the impact of their rivalry is something that reshaped our world and continues to influence how we view space exploration today. The Soviets continued to focus on other achievements, such as space stations and robotic missions, showing their shift in priorities. In the end, the space race wasn't just about who won or lost. It was about pushing the limits of human potential, and both nations did just that. They transformed the impossible into the possible. And while the US may have been the first to plant a flag on the moon, both sides showed the world what humans can accomplish when we set our sights beyond the horizon.